A primeira sessão terá como tema Tendência global, liderança e cooperação para a promoção da inclusão financeira. Para presidir esta primeira sessão, eu convido a senhora Marusa Vasconcelos Freire, chefe adjunta do Departamento de Educação Financeira do Banco Central do Brasil. Vamos recebê-la. Como palestrantes, eu anuncio o senhor Alfred, Diretor Executivo da Aliança para a Inclusão Financeira, AFI, e a senhora Margaret Miller, analista sênior das áreas de Inclusão e Educação Financeiras do Banco Mundial. Agradeço a que todos tomem os seus lugares e passo imediatamente a palavra à senhora Marusa Vasconcelos Freire, chefe adjunta do Departamento de Educação Financeira do Banco Central do Brasil, que fará suas considerações iniciais e, a partir de então, conduzirá os trabalhos desta primeira sessão, Tendência global, liderança e cooperação para a promoção da inclusão financeira. Bom debate a todos.
Boa tarde a todos, boa tarde a Margaret e ao Alfred. É um prazer estar aqui inaugurando essa sessão que vai falar sobre tendência global, liderança e cooperação para a promoção da inclusão financeira, que, na verdade, são dois princípios para a promoção de uma inclusão financeira inovadora, princípios da Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion, da parceria global para a inclusão financeira, né? Vou fazer algumas breves considerações e depois passarei a palavra para os nossos convidados. Na verdade, há mais de uma década que o Banco Central, desde o final de 90, tem liderado essa articulação entre parceiros públicos e privados para procurar ampliar o acesso aos serviços financeiros, tendo em vista que esse acesso é importante tanto para combater a pobreza como para o desenvolvimento de pequenas e microempresas e da economia em geral, né? Essa articulação institucional, ela tem envolvido basicamente a divulgação de questões correntes sobre o tema inclusão financeira, junto com a sociedade, com a participação da sociedade e das instituições do sistema financeiro e de todos os interessados no assunto. E também com compartilhamento do conhecimento que muitas vezes só o Banco Central mesmo detém, né, na busca de soluções que possam nortear sua atuação específica como regulador e supervisor do sistema financeiro, né? Então, em consonância assim, com a tendência global de cada momento durante essa década, um pouco mais de uma década, o foco inicial desse esforço do Banco Central e através desses fóruns que tem sido realizado em parceria com o SEBRAE, tem evoluído, vamos dizer, né, de uma visão, já foi dito aqui pelo Casalberto, né, de uma visão do microcrédito, passando então para um problema das microfinanças, e finalmente a gente amplia o escopo para a inclusão financeira. E agora, mais do que isso, a gente coloca na agenda, então, a questão da cidadania financeira em si, e a importância que isso tem para assegurar a efetiva inclusão social e também melhorar a qualidade de vida das pessoas com agenda um pouco mais abrangente, incluindo a educação financeira e a proteção também dos consumidores de serviços financeiros, né? Nesse sentido, desde 2010, acompanhando o reconhecimento, então, da declaração feita pelos líderes do G20 no encontro de Seul, no sentido de que a inclusão financeira é um dos mais importantes pilares para a agenda do desenvolvimento global, o Banco Central elevou a inclusão financeira a um de seus objetivos estratégicos no planejamento da instituição, né? E tendo como objetivo maior contribuir com isso, quer dizer, o reconhecimento de que a inclusão financeira contribui para a missão mesmo institucional do banco de assegurar a solidez e a eficiência do sistema financeiro nacional. E, desde então, que o Banco Central, além da participação nesses encontros e nesses debates, nessa liderança e articulação com a sociedade civil no Brasil, também tem participado da agenda internacional em fóruns específicos sobre o tema, né? E aí, nesse sentido, através de redes globais formadas por especialistas, reguladores e supervisores dos sistemas financeiros, onde ali se compartilha, então, o conhecimento sobre temas relacionados com a inclusão financeira. E aí teremos aqui a participação do Alfred, que é da Aliança para a Inclusão Financeira. Também participamos da Rede Internacional de Educação Financeira, através de uma iniciativa suportada pela OCDE. E, mais recentemente, estamos nos preparando para participar também mais ativamente da Finconet, que seria com temas mais voltados para a proteção do consumidor de serviços financeiros, né? E esses 3 temas, já existe assim uma espécie de consenso, vamos dizer, internacional, no sentido de que eles realmente estão integrados e se interligam como componentes de uma agenda única que é necessária para o empoderamento, que é fundamental para promover o bem-estar financeiro dos cidadãos e das pequenas e microempresas, ao mesmo tempo que contribui para assegurar a estabilidade financeira, o crescimento econômico, inclusive e o desenvolvimento sustentável. Então, na verdade, é uma agenda que liga muito diretamente o local ao global, né? E isso é a grande importância, então, do tema, né? E o reconhecimento da relevância desses assuntos que levou, então, a que o Banco Central promovesse, inclusive, uma reestruturação na sua organização, no sentido de criar uma área para cuidar de relacionamento institucional e cidadania. E também a criação de um departamento de supervisão de conduta junto à fiscalização, né? E, a partir de 2013, então, foi lançado um programa muito mais abrangente, que não se restringe a uma só área do Banco Central, mas que cuida da cooperação e articulação entre os diversos departamentos do Banco Central em temas relacionados, então, com a inclusão, com a educação e com a proteção dos consumidores de serviços financeiros, né? E esses temas todos e essa agenda, os senhores terão a oportunidade aqui de conhecer. A gente vai ter, o diretor Antero já falou das oficinas de trabalho amanhã. Quer dizer, a ideia nesse espaço que vocês possam, de fato, participar da opinião, contribuir com alguma sugestão. Então, a gente vai estar aberto a isso, né? Serão 5 oficinas, né? Algumas na área mais de regulação, outras na área de educação financeira, inclusão e também a questão de proteção, né? Quer dizer, terão mais oportunidade de conhecer melhor o registrato, o RDR, o sistema RDR. E aí, mas nesse painel agora, então, a gente tem 2 apresentações que são relacionadas de alguma forma a essa cooperação internacional e essa busca de soluções para a inclusão e educação financeira. A primeira, que vai ser do Alfred, que é o diretor executivo da AF, e que vai tratar de nos apresentar uma visão, então, da inclusão financeira como uma questão global, que é do interesse de todos, e que necessita, de fato, de cooperação em todos os níveis, desde o nível local, o nível nacional, regional e global, né? E para que possa efetivamente produzir resultados concretos no sentido de alcance de suas metas e objetivos, né? E a segunda, que será da Margaret, que ela nos apresentará os resultados de uma análise da avaliação de impacto que já foi feita em cima de 187 intervenções no campo da educação financeira, e que procura responder a um questionamento que eu acho que muito interessante, né? Que é se você consegue, então, ensinar alguém a ser financeiramente capaz, né? Então, a dinâmica dos trabalhos, eu vou pedir que o Alfred fale primeiro, cada um terá de 15 a, no máximo, 20 minutos, e, em seguida, eu farei uma amarração sobre o que eles falaram e a gente encerra o debate. Então, eu chamo o Alfred para falar aqui.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marusa. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I will unfortunately not be able to speak in Portuguese. Sorry for that. I could do Spanish, but my Spanish is not good enough, so I think you would be even more confused. So that's why I stick to English, but I'm aware that some of you maybe can use the device or even follow me directly. My first point is not on my list here of what I wanted to say, and that is really share with you how impressed I am by the size and the vibrancy of this event. You know, in the Alliance for Financial Inclusion, we see many things during the year, but seeing this with 1,000 people registered, and I understand another 400 rejected, this is amazing. And I mean, a big achievement, as I understand, under the Brazilian Maya Declaration commitment, which I think was the national partnership. So I think this is great, and congratulations for such a great initiative and event. Looks very impressive. Thank you very much for inviting us. Well, just a quick words on the Alliance for Financial Inclusion, who we are. Those of you who don't know us, we are a network of financial inclusion policymakers and regulators. Our joint objective is to drive financial inclusion, access, usage, and quality through, as we say, smart policy making and better regulation. So this is what brings us together. And in this network, we have like 121 member institutions, mostly central banks and other financial regulators from 95 countries. So what we're actually doing is we are engaging ourselves in a global peer learning and knowledge sharing effort where we all look for the same objective, which is bringing the underserved and the poor into financial access and better financial access. And I think this is exactly the same objective that brings you together today. We are doing this through many ways. We organize global working groups on specific topics, technical topics, regulatory issues. Digital financial services is one. Consumer empowerment and market conduct is another one. We do data and measurement, financial inclusion strategy, and a couple of others. And in each of these working groups, we have regulators and policymakers working together to produce such solutions. But on the other hand, we also do direct exchanges, exposures, and also production of knowledge products and so forth. So it's a full range of activities that is meant to strengthen the capacity and the knowledge of our members to do their job. AFI is currently based in Bangkok. We are moving to Kuala Lumpur very soon, to Malaysia. Simply the reason is that AFI is, after 5.5 years of its existence as a project, is going to become an independent organization, as an independent legal entity, where the countries or the member institutions will become the owners. And this is what is happening just now. So in a couple of weeks, we are moving and moving into our new home, which is provided by the Central Bank of Malaysia. Let me perhaps start my remarks with just a few reflections on three trends, global trends that I can identify, which I think very much reflect what AFI is at the moment. And these three trends, I think all of you have come across, either through your own work or even how your country is involved in these issues. Now, the first trend, and I think Marusa mentioned it already, financial inclusion is a global challenge, and financial inclusion is in the interest of everyone. We have mentioned G20, we have mentioned Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion. Yes, global institutions have taken that up. I think the core of the problem is that worldwide we still have these 2.5 billion people without access to finance, out of which 90% are living in the developing world. But that doesn't mean that this is just a development issue or an issue of developing countries. Financial inclusion is also in the interest of developed nations. We have developed nations with increasing rates of financial exclusion, which comes in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And of course, we also see many quality issues, which ultimately led to the last financial crisis. So financial inclusion is in the interest of all. And I mean, just to give you this one figure, when you look, for example, at the United States, you have 22 million adults in the United States without a bank account. I mean, this is less than 10% of the population, but it is a big number. And when you look into this number, you will see that 18% of these people are Afro-Americans who don't have a bank account. So there is an issue, and we identify similar issues elsewhere. Now, why is financial inclusion such an important global issue? I could go through a long list of even empirical evidence, macro evidence, micro evidence. We have seen that there's a link between financial development and economic development. We have seen that there's micro evidence on why even a very simple access to a financial service can make a huge difference in a poor people's person. These evidences are out there. We can look at them. We have also seen that financial inclusion can secure economic resilience, because you can, by financial inclusion, of course, diversify your funding base, which makes you less vulnerable to external shocks. But at the end of the day, what is the most important thing? We all talk about inclusive growth, and we, not only in AFI, I think also everywhere, we believe, and I think I heard one speech in the afternoon with a similar remark. We say inclusive growth starts with financial inclusion, and this is very important. So this is the first trend, a real recognition of this issue. And this has led in many of AFI's member institutions and in the countries to the fact that the regulators and the policymakers have started to take financial inclusion into their mandate, even as central banks. This has not been the case like 10 or 15 years ago. This is a new trend, which I think very, very much demonstrates how important financial inclusion has become. Now, the second trend I want to look at, the developing world, and I should say developing and emerging countries strive for a stronger role in global governance. This also is reflected in AFI. First of all, I think Brazil is part of the new development bank. You have gone through the discussion of the BRICS Bank. What was the reason for that? Some of you felt that perhaps some of the voices around the international tables were not taken into account when it came to changes of global governance. And AFI is exactly that, an initiative that is driven by those countries who have the knowledge on a specific issue, namely financial inclusion, and they are now forming their own organization. This, I think, is a clear reflection of a trend that developing countries and emerging economies are striving for a stronger role in global governance. A third trend, which we all witness, is there is a new cooperation model internationally coming now to our attention. And this cooperation model is very much based on knowledge sharing and peer learning. Why is that so? Because most of the solutions that... Sorry, can't you? Okay. Let me try like this perhaps. Is this better? Okay. Most of the solutions that can be found around the world on financial inclusion, be it correspondent banking in Brazil, digital finance in countries like Philippines or Kenya, now Tanzania, Bangladesh, Pakistan, so many others, data and measurement, financial education, consumer protections, most of these solutions come from the developing world. And there is a clear interest to share and to learn from each other. But the difference is that this sharing and learning from each other works in a specific way. There are equal voices, people around the table, and they adapt, in many cases, what they learn to their own country context. I think this is a new quality, and this makes it what AFI is, namely a new model of cooperation. And I want to give you a couple of examples what is happening. For example, delegations from China, from the Central Bank of China, go to Peru and to USA to learn about regulation of very small financial institutions. Or delegations from Kenya go to Russia because Russia is interested in digital financial services regulation and look at Kenya. And we also have seen Banco Central do Brazil being part of such exchanges because many delegations already came to Brazil to learn on new experience from correspondent banking. So this is really a very visible third trend, which I think also makes AFI, knowledge sharing and peer learning on the global level. When we prepared, or when we were asked to prepare for this presentation, I was also asked whether I could share with you some latest progress by the AFI members. Now, before I can share some very tangible results with you, let me just share 4 things with you, what is actually going on in the network at the moment. The first thing, I think, and you're all aware of it, is technology is really driving financial inclusion. Lowering the costs of retail banking is the issue. And when I was at the G20 private sector consultation meeting in February in Australia, in fact, it was Deputy Governor Luis Pereira who talked about a revolution in this field, a revolution that is revolutionizing banking. And the interesting aspect here, it is not only bringing at lower cost more people into formal financial services, it also challenges traditional banking in many ways, as you now can see, especially in the developed world, with new providers, especially for payment services popping up. A second point I want to make, what we see in the network as a clear trend, the demand side comes into the focus. The responsible provision of financial services, which actually means protecting the interests of small and poor customers through financial education and consumer protection. So this demand side trend, I think, is clearly reflected in your work here today, and also in the fact that AFI is getting more and more requests from member institutions in this area. Actually, our biggest working group is the one on consumer market, on market conduct and financial education. The third trend that we see, and this I think is also reflected in this room, there is a clear interest from all partners in the financial sector ecosystem to engage in effective partnerships. We call it public-private dialogue, and we see many examples around the globe. As this forum also reflects, these partnerships can take place among all stakeholders and can produce win-win solutions for everyone. And the last point I want to mention, what we observe, members of AFI are seeking more and more engagement with the global standard-setting bodies, with the interest really to interpret what can be done in terms of proportionate financial inclusion in a good way, in a safe and sound way, but at the same time use the flexibility that is given by the standard-setting bodies. And there's an ongoing dialogue which I think is very productive. Now, what we see in AFI, apart from the very strong growth of the membership, we have 53 commitments under the Maya Declaration right now. We have seen in the first 5.5 years 71 concrete policy reforms that have been a result of AFI activities. For example, this is a very new data. We have seen a growth of mobile money accounts in the AFI network up by 20%, and we have seen a growth of agent outlets in the AFI member countries, registration gone up by 70% in the past years. We have also seen a growing number of knowledge products like guidelines and technical notes that are exchanged and where many of the regulators, even in this room, take part. And we have seen G20 and GPFI activities where AFI is an implementing partner. On financial education and how financial education can have an impact on savings, I must say there is globally still a lack of evidence. We have a scarcity of evidence, and we can do much more to understand what the causality is. So I can only encourage all of you, as you do during this forum, to do more research and provide better understanding so that other countries can also learn from your experience. We have a couple of examples. For example, one I can mention is India, where two-day training programs in 2 districts have have provided financial education training to low-income clients of branchless banking. And there was a significant impact of savings uptake in terms of that 29% increase took place in the treatment group after 1 year. So that's quite impressive. We don't have many of these figures. We have seen another one, which is in Peru, where 10.9% of savers in a region where financial education was conducted was an increase of 10.9%. Now, this is a call really to do more. But before I end, I think I would like to share with you quickly what has been Brazil's role as we see it globally, but also in the network. First of all, I should say that from the beginning, Brazil was a very active member in AFI. And please allow me this personal remark. In the first AFI Global Policy Forum, when we were launched in 2009 in Kenya, Banco Central do Brasil was represented by then head of department, Luis Edson Feltrin. And I remember we had an exhibition outside, so we were walking around, and I was walking next to him, and the exhibition showed results from correspondent banking in Brazil, and Edson Feltrin stood there with me and said, well, I can't believe that this is my country. So we had a conversation on what is happening in your country, and I think 9 months later, Brazil joined the alliance. BCB is also in 2 working groups. One is the Consumer Protection and Financial Education Working Group. You made the Maya commitment at the Riviera Maya in Mexico in 2009. You are now organizing the International Week of Financial Inclusion, which is a peer learning program for other countries who can come to Brazil to learn from you. I think we see the next one in a couple of weeks with 7 delegations coming from 7 countries. Banco Central is also engaged in what we call an advisory program for other central banks. I think the next one and the first one is in January when Banco Central do Brasil goes to Tanzania to work with Tanzanian colleagues on agent banking regulation. But Banco Central is also increasingly engaged in the network in the governance. So, for example, the bank played a very strong role in the independence process by participating in the AFI subcommittee on independence, which constructed the governance, but also in the steering committee most recently, which is the board of AFI. But Brazil was also very active on the global level, and especially in the first steps on the G20 level when the Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion was constructed. I think Brazil played a major role in the Financial Inclusion Expert Group, Rodrigo, right? So I can only say, in closing, thank you very much for your great collaboration. Keep going. I think you are in very good company. On the other hand, you're very important to be a role model and to continue to be a role model for financial inclusion. We very much depend on you. What is very impressive is this national partnership, because apparently you managed to institutionalize financial inclusion. So no matter what administration you will have, this will continue. And I think this is a great achievement of leadership and cooperation. what is also the theme of this panel. So thank you very much, and all the best for the future.
Afternoon. I want to start by thanking the Central Bank and its partners for the invitation to be with you today. As Alfred said and Marusa, this is just a great showing, and it's very, I have to say, typical of these events that you get so many people coming out to learn about what's the next thing in the financial inclusion agenda in Brazil. So I'm very happy to be a part of this. Today, and if we could start the slides, what I'm going to be presenting about today is some research that we conducted at the World Bank as part of the Global Financial Development Report for 2014. And it focuses on financial inclusion and is available, the full report and the background, all the background information on the World Bank website. If you put Global Financial Development Report, you'll find it very easily. And what we wanted to know is we wanted to do exactly what Alfred was mentioning, that we were concerned that there's a lack of solid evidence about what works in financial capability, financial literacy. You know, can you teach someone to behave in a financially capable way? And so what we're going to be talking about today is the results of this meta-analysis that we did, and I'll explain that because it's for social scientists aren't as familiar with it usually as biologists and people in medicine with this statistical technique. But we really cast a wide net to understand what's the evidence base. And as I look out here, I want to enlist you in a little bit of some imagination. Think back to when you were in high school chemistry or biology. Kind of put on a white coat, because I'd like you to accompany me as we go through the presentation a little bit in being researchers about financial education and financial capability. Because as was mentioned earlier, there's still a lot to learn. And if we're going to really make progress on this knowledge agenda, one of the things that's come out of this research project is we really have to get everybody sharing their insights, sharing the findings, and really becoming part of a global knowledge base in much the same way that, you know, if we were studying what works for cancer, that people would be, you know, sharing those findings, building on one another's insights. So if we could go to the next slide, we could probably skip the next one to be on. Oh, I've got it. Here we go. Let's see. Should it? Oops. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Okay. So, so this is just the organization for the talk. And at the end, I did want to just highlight, we're going to talk about how we could expedite and strengthen this knowledge base. So probably for this audience, I don't need to spend very much time on this, but I just want to go over what we built off of as we did this work was the fact that we know that people make the wrong financial decision often. You know, so even educated people who have financial knowledge, people who have masters in business administration can get overextended with credit, can fail to properly plan for their retirement or save for needs of their, children's education. So we know that, but we know also that it's not evenly spread. People who are typically have lower incomes, lower levels of education are likely to make more mistakes. And there is definitely a role, and this was something one of my colleagues at the bank was highlighting as we talked about the presentation I was going to give a couple days ago. There are, of course, roles, and it's very important to think about how regulation can help to compensate for a lack of financial knowledge and financial capability. For example, opt-out clauses for pensions, where the default is that you're signed up to save for retirement, can really rapidly increase participation in pension plans, probably much more efficiently than a financial education campaign. But there aren't always those kind of, maybe let's say on some level, simpler solutions. Sometimes you have people who are in the informal economy and don't have that option. We heard that even in, the advanced countries, not everybody has a formal bank account and an easy way to kind of automatically, move money from one account to another and save. And there are aggressive marketing techniques that people need to be able to defend themselves against. So what we did is we wanted to understand what does the literature say? What do the studies say that actually evaluate an intervention, a financial capability or financial education intervention? Meaning, the literature we're looking at isn't a study of, let's discuss what should be part of financial literacy policy, or we did a survey to see how financially literate were people in Brazil. What we were looking at is, was there an intervention? Was there a classroom-based, instruction? Was there a television show that incorporated financial messages? Was there a phone-based or text message that was sending people reminders to save? Those types of things, even if they weren't rigorously evaluated, we pulled them into our review. And one of the reasons that I think the evidence has been, let's say, isn't so clear up to this point, and that's what this slide is, it's kind of hard to read, but is that basically previous literature reviews didn't look at the same information. Everybody was looking at different information. So this is the first really comprehensive casting a wide net to try to see what we could find. And going back to the year 2000 in terms of online access to the information, we were able to collect 188 papers that are global. So we didn't limit it to one region. We didn't limit it to any specific kind of intervention. So this is the largest database of financial capability, financial literacy interventions that's been assembled to our knowledge. So here's where, put on your white coats, think about what we found in terms of this literature and what might be some hypotheses you would test or things that you would want to consider. So in terms of the type of publication out of these reports, you'll see that less than a third were in peer-reviewed journals. So we really did try to pull in what's sometimes called the gray literature, things that would have been published more informally. What we found was before the financial crisis of kind of 2008, a vast majority of the studies were done in the United States. And I think there are probably multiple reasons for this. One is that in the United States that also the individual has a very high role for his or her financial lives. There's fewer defaults, more responsibility for retirement, and there's probably just was more attention to this topic in the academic literature. But we find that after the crisis, there's a real growth and interest in this topic globally. Here's the topic. Savings has been mentioned repeatedly today. We did find that if you're looking at a single topic, savings is the one that comes up most frequently. You can see on this slide about 30% of the interventions that in these papers focused on savings or retirement savings, general savings or retirement savings. 43% were what we called mixed interventions, meaning they might have talked about both credit and savings or mortgages and general savings, so some kind of combination of skills. As you can see, relatively little was in the literature that we pulled together on kind of business finances. So this was really the personal finance literature. In terms of intervention channel, I was interested to hear what's going to be available now in Brazil in terms of online education. What we found up to 2013 was that this was not common. That by far, and it was about more than 50%, 54%, as you can see here, of the interventions used a classroom-based method. And of course, if you think about it, that's the most expensive way to intervene, right? You have a person actually teaching a relatively small group of people. Now, if you can go through the schools, you can take advantage of a captive population, a trained educator. There are economies of scale, and that's certainly something that we think is very valuable to change those habits at a young age. But especially when you're thinking about the adult population, it is a relatively expensive way to go. And as you can see, very few interventions that use newer techniques like mass media, the phone, online have been studied at all. In terms of the location of the intervention, we found Many of them were provided by third parties. Sometimes these would be nonprofits that do credit counseling for lower income groups, for example, in a place like the United States. A lot of workplace counseling was included. And here you again have you have an opportunity of a captive population and potentially a nice alignment of interests, because your employer wants you not to be thinking about, how you can't pay your bill when you go home that night, or you're getting calls from a creditor. They want you to be thinking about your job. So there's an alignment of interest, and often people respond favorably to getting financial education in the workplace. As you can see, financial institutions are only 11% here, and that's, I think, partially reflects or could reflect the fact that the alignment of incentives isn't quite as clear often, because if your financial provider is giving you information, you may wonder, is it in my interest or is it in the provider's interest? In terms of, so these next ones are, I feel like, a little bit some of our money slides in terms of why would it be that there's been so much difficulty from the literature showing that there's an impact from financial education. If you see, this is the hours of the intervention. So on the far left-hand side, you have interventions of 2 hours or less, and that's 16% of the sample. If you go up to 10 hours or less, you're getting 40% of the sample. The varied bar on the far right, which is 43%, that's probably, we think, we don't have any reason to think it wouldn't be kind of evenly or in kind of at a representative level arrayed across those other a number of hours. So in other words, that 43%, probably a lot of those are very short duration interventions. So if you think of that, there's, we're asking a lot in a couple of hours to get people to change their behavior, right? About something as meaningful to them as finance, which has to do with, what you're going to buy, what you're going to eat, how you're going to present yourself to the world. Then we looked at this issue of intensity, and you can think of it, we were talking about as scientists, this is kind of the dosage amount, right? How much of the antibiotic are you giving to the patient to get them to have a financially healthy life? This is the duration. How many, this is in terms of weeks. How many weeks did the duration of the intervention last? Here you have a third lasting 1 week or less. So these would be 1 day, maybe a weekend, maybe a couple of days during the week. You go over 50% last 6 months or less. And those could, here it's not the idea that it's a daily intervention. It could be something that happened once a week, once a month. But we tried to understand over what period of time was this being reinforced. As a comparison, and the people in the room that are from the Brazil's activity on the school-based financial education program know I like it very much. But just as a point of comparison about why it may have shown to have such good results, the number of hours, which if you remember going back here, almost none lasted more than 50 hours. It's over 70 hours of instruction. So there, what Brazil is doing is really kind of off the charts, literally. And then in terms of duration of intervention, it's approximately, I'd say, 1.5 years. So it's a much more intensive intervention at the high school level than is typical for the studies in the literature. Okay, so meta-analysis, what you do is you really pull together evidence from a bunch of different studies to see if those individual studies didn't give you quite enough evidence, but pulling them together, pulling multiple studies together can give you the evidence you want. Now, this literature really presents some problems for doing that, and we are very upfront about that fact, and that we know that that's the case. Because what you have, as you saw, with these, the description of the different kinds of interventions that are trying to increase savings or reduce loan defaults or get people to take, kind of plan their finances, is that they're very, very different types of interventions in that literature. So, you could think of it, does it make sense to put together, let's say, an intervention at the village level in Vietnam to increase savings with Brazil's high school program, with something in, a university in the United States that's for professors? I mean, this is really the variation of the kinds of studies that we found. That said, we wanted to see where were there similar enough studies that we could do some analysis across this sample. And what we had to do is we had to look at those that had binary variables, such as, for example, for savings, did the savings increase or not? So 1, a variable of 1 if savings increased, 0 if it didn't increase as a result of the intervention. The same for retirement savings. For loan defaults, it would have been 1 when the loan default, fell as a result of the intervention, 0 if it didn't. So doing that, what we were able to do, I'll just go back for a minute, is we found out of this 188 studies, literally kind of just a handful on these different, across these different outcome variables that we could actually compare, which is discouraging because, you have all this great database and then what you can actually do empirically is restricted to many fewer. So I'll quickly just show these. These are called forest plots. And the one that had the strongest impact by far, and of course it's not very many papers, I think it's 6 papers, but they are all randomized controlled trials, is savings. So savings came out at the 95% confidence interval, these 6 papers, as having a positive impact. The interventions had a positive impact. And you can see that, for those of you who are interested, the diamond kind of towards the bottom is to the right of the null hypothesis. So you can reject the null hypothesis that the savings, that the intervention, the financial capability intervention wasn't effective in increasing savings rates. This is retirement savings. Visually, it doesn't quite communicate as well as it might, but this was, we found significance at the 90% confidence interval, but not at the 95. So a little bit less strong evidence for retirement savings for whatever reason. I'm going through this quickly just in the interest of time. Record-keeping behaviors we found also have not statistically significant at the 90%, but almost. But we found something interesting with this, which was that it had the strongest impact from having a longer duration of the intervention. So it seemed that people needed a certain amount of time. I would think it was between 10 and 15 hours of instruction around record keeping to really have a behavior change. Loan defaults, we could not reject the null hypothesis that the financial education hadn't been successful. And we think there could be multiple reasons for this. Maybe by the time you get into a credit problem, getting some financial education just isn't going to help you get out because you had a health problem, you lost your job. And it could also be that people are more skeptical of getting credit information for those reasons we mentioned earlier. And so, the information about how can I help you to save is easier to take on board than let me talk to you about credit. So there are limits in what we can learn from this. But what I wanted to put forth, there's some of the nice curriculum from Brazil. Here's a program that we did in South Africa. But what I wanted to put forth was that there's an opportunity here for the global community to really come together to improve the knowledge that we have. So instead of that 188 papers being papers that couldn't be compared, that had very different outcome measures, that had failed to really do a rigorous job in reporting the statistical information, there's an opportunity for all of us as researchers, as representatives of institutions in different places in Brazil and in the world to come together around some common standards and some common ways to do some of this methodology, ways to define it, ways to report on it, ways to maybe register it as they do with scientific research to say, hey, I'm going to do an impact evaluation over here in Curitiba on this financial education program. You tell the world, then you report your findings. So I hope that this, maybe the conversations we're having today, maybe the support of AFI, the support of the central bank, institutions like the World Bank that I'm from, I think it would be great if we could really push this knowledge frontier forward and in a couple of years have something really much more conclusive to say about the role of financial education on financial behaviors. Thank you very much.
Nós já estamos pouco atrasados na agenda, eu não vou falar muito, só queria agradecer, então, a participação aí do Alfred, mostrando como essa cooperação internacional é importante. O que é reforçado agora pelas conclusões aí da Margaret, no sentido de que a gente deve fazer um esforço coordenado, sobretudo para avaliar o impacto dessas ações, normas, novas regulações da educação, dos programas de educação financeira. E esse é um dos esforços, né, que tem sido desenvolvido pelo Banco Central e que vocês vão poder compreender melhor até nas oficinas amanhã, como que a gente tem iniciado o trabalho nesse sentido. Então, eu queria que vocês, mais uma vez, já juntassem uma salva de palmas para os convidados.